Hello again, and welcome back to another episode of Debatable Physics. We hope you enjoyed our episode last time on extraterrestrial life. And today we're joined once again by Mark.
Hello again.
And we're going to be trying to follow on from something we briefly mentioned last time, which is the topic of whether or not we should fund science using public sector money. To try and make this fair, I'm going to play devil's advocate, as obviously we are slightly biased in our opinions, and we want to make this a fair representation of some of the arguments that people would have for and against this. But obviously, I myself am biased, but I will try my best. To start with, I'm just going to give a bit of background about the current state of funding here in the UK. So, science funded by the government is done through the UK Research and Innovation, which is a national funding agency comprised of 7 research councils, and they have a combined budget of £7 billion. This includes the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council and the Science and Technology Facilities Council, which have respective budgets of about £1 billion and £730 million. To put that into perspective, the budgets for some of the other sectors for the year 2019 to 2020, Defence had a budget of £55 billion, Education had a budget of £116, Health had £178, and Transport had £44 billion. So it's in the same sort of ballpark of some of these figures, but it is considerably less than all of these. So 7 billion compared to 55 billion on defence. Do you think that's a fair split of money there?
It's really nice to hear those comparisons, actually, because I didn't know. It's difficult to know how much money is spent on things. And actually, it's really nice to think about, okay, so if we are going to spend more money on something like science, where does that come from? You know, it's got to come from somewhere else. So do we take it from, i.e. defence, and put it into science, or do we take it from education and put it into science? It's those sort of arguments, I think, is where you've got to think about what's going on. But from those figures, it's a tiny amount. It's hardly anything at all, really. And considering, I suppose you've got to consider the impact that it has. You've got to consider how much value is created from investing into science. And I think our case would be that there is huge amounts of potential worth in investing in science. And if we don't do that, then you're missing out on potential future funds.
Yeah, so another thing to note that I forgot to mention was that the £7 billion includes all research. So one of the 7 councils it includes is the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which has a budget of £140 million. So not all of that £7 billion is going into science, it's just going into research in general. So if we think about science itself, that's a much smaller number.
Yeah, I think that shows our biases right from the very beginning. As soon as we talk about research, we're thinking it's got to be science. There can be no other type of research. But again, the values that other, funding those other areas of research, to me, is equally important. To be fair, I think it's value creation. I think that's what you've got to think about. And what better than something like science to create value around what we're doing. It's maximising the effectiveness of people. People can have all the best ideas in the world, but without the funding to follow it through, it gets lost. So sometimes I think you've got to, put your money where your mouth is and say, right, we value these people. Let's show them how much we value them, and let them do what they need to do. Now, that doesn't mean there doesn't need to be criteria. That doesn't mean there doesn't need to be a control of it. You can't just give away money for nothing. But yeah.
So I guess one of the arguments that I saw most often for not wanting to fund science is the fact that that same money could then be used for other things. So, for example, if we scrap that £7 billion for research here in the UK, we could send that money as foreign aid to other countries. We could try and tackle larger global issues such as world hunger, just there are so many other more pressing issues that we could be using that money on right now. Why should we be spending it on science?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument for. I mean, I was mentioning earlier about talking about things like value for money, and where that comes from, and that whole discussion about accidental discoveries. I mean, we've got things like stainless steel was another one of those accidental discoveries. It's sometimes you've got to think: do we fund these things for a pure research angle? Do we just fund it for the curiosity of doing it, or should it be directed towards a specific aim and a specific goal? Because if you direct it so tightly, then sometimes you do miss out on those other accidental discoveries. You do miss out on that wider chance of cross-disciplinary discoveries and other people discovering things by chance. I mean, for example, there's been lots of work, cross-disciplinary work with engineering and medical sciences on the whole COVID crisis. And having those connections and having those people that have got that experience means they can turn their hands to lots of other things. Whether that's a good reason to fund all science. There's lots of science I see that isn't particularly good. I mean, there's the famous Ig Nobles, which I absolutely love, which is some crazy science that's really funded and researched. But it's like, what's the perfect percentage of cheese in a cheese sandwich? Uh, should that receive public funding to do? Yeah, it's a bit of fun, and I'm sure there was a deeper something behind it. But it's all those type of things. And there's lots of research where they prove that they've done lots of research saying going to school increases your educational chances. Really? That's fascinating. I don't think you need lots of research money to find that out. So I think sometimes there is a lot of money, and I think the public see this lot of money being splashed around for things that aren't really needed. And I think that does a disservice to the sector as a whole. And I think they feel like that's the only thing where funding gets, where I think we need to celebrate all the things that gets amazing funding and has these amazing results. And without that funding, just wouldn't have happened. And I think maybe that's what we're really bad at scientists, publicising what we're really successful at.
I guess my counter argument for that would be, have you heard of the Golden Rice Project?
I have, yes.
Yeah, so that was a project put forward because a lot of kids in developing countries were lacking in vitamin A, I believe. And so they developed a type of rice that contained vitamin A in order to provide these kids with more nutrients. And that was a very successful project, and it worked. So science, I guess, can be used for good. If there is something pressing that science can do, someone inevitably will try and do it. But it's just okay, so for the example I used, ending world hunger, that's not something that science can always directly fix. Obviously we can use research to try and figure out ways to create food more efficiently, to try and generate more food from the same amount of land, things like that. But at the end of the day, even if we have that research available, it's up to bigger organizations like countries as a whole to try and implement those techniques. And if a country doesn't have the means to implement them, then that's not something science can fix. That's something that the world as a whole needs to fix.
But what you say about, that whole area, though, the problem with that is, genetic engineering, etc., that just it causes fear in the public. So you say there's money being devoted towards, creating disease-resistant crops or things like that. And I think people instantaneously think you're messing with nature. And it becomes something that people fight against rather than celebrate the fact that we can do this. And I think that's where funding and research councils need to work a lot better and to be part of that education of the public. So the public have a say in what goes on as much as it just happens to them. And I think if that starts happening, then I think people will be a lot more accepting of funding of these science projects. If they feel part of that process rather than it's just something that they couldn't possibly understand and they just read about all the fear factor of, creating all these genetically engineered creatures that are going to eat them.
So do you think that if there was better communication in science, that people would be more willing to put funding into it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but scientists aren't necessarily always the best people to be able to communicate what they're doing to the general public. Um, they've spent a long time being experts in their field. We need people who are better at communicating science, and I think that's one of the reasons why I think science in schools needs to be taught so much better. Because not so much better. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. I think science in schools is important to be taught so that people have a better understanding of what science is about. So those that are naturally want to go into journalism or communication or mass media or whatever it is, or social media influencers, whatever they want to be, if they have a little bit more understanding of science, then they can appreciate what's going on and they can influence other people.
I guess I was going to say that maybe if people are getting limited amount of funds, they might not prioritize communication. So they might think, okay, I only have X amount of money. I would rather spend like the majority of that money on the actual research than setting some money aside to do communication or like public awareness about the research I'm doing. Okay, so the next point I have is that science can be used for harm, not just good. So, for example, the Manhattan Project, the creation of the atom bomb, how do we justify research into that when the aftermath was the loss of so many innocent lives?
You like the controversial stuff, don't you? You're really going for it.
Yeah, it's called debatable physics for a reason, Mark.
So, I mean, there is an argument about the atom bomb that it saved, millions of lives because it ended the war earlier. So there's all that sort of angle. Now, as a scientist, I think we need to be very careful about making predictions that we don't know, and I think we are very much based on the science of here and now. The here and now science is that the processes that goes on inside those nuclear bombs and fusion bombs can and does generate electricity. It does generate power. So we have nuclear power stations. Now, again, nuclear power stations are very misunderstood, considered incredibly dangerous. We have experience of this. We've got, we have a lot, Long Island in America. We've got the Fukushima reactor. So there's all sorts of things that we know can go wrong. And yet we've got lots of nuclear reactors around the world that have worked perfectly fine and perfectly, in a perfectly good way for so long and generated our baseline electricity for so long. And that wasn't necessarily celebrated, whereas all the disasters were, or not celebrated, but and put out there as a potential flaw of nuclear power, and this was going to again be something that was going to be dramatically wrong with science rather than something that has been incredibly successful for science. I think we're far more skeptical of science than we ever used to be. You don't have to go back very far when science was seen as the panacea. It was seen as the solution. You look back at things like when radiation was discovered and radium, and you had radium in toothpaste, you had radium in soda dispenser bottles because it was considered new and exciting and science, and that was going to be the solution. And obviously that had bad influences. There were things there that shouldn't have been done. We used to x-ray children's feet just to find out what shoe size they were. That type of thing is now been thought of as that was dumb at the time. And I think now we're a lot more skeptical. I mean, you just look at 5G telecommunications and the skepticism and the concern around that is so huge that people have been setting fire to these things, setting fire to the 5G masks because they think it's going to cause cancer or even COVID. Going back to that, there was stories that it was being caused by 5G masks, and lots of people believed it. And I think again, it comes down to the science that get publicised isn't the science that we want to get publicised. It seems to be all the negative stories that get publicised rather than the positive news stories.
Some people believe that we would be better off without all of this scientific and technological advancement that we have. Like, sure, it's benefited the world a lot, but it's also caused a lot more problems. So, for example, the use of fossil fuels and the Industrial Revolution in general has led to climate change. And another example is the use of CFCs led to the hole in the ozone layer. So a lot of the science research that we're doing right now is purely just to fix the mistakes that we've made in the past. If we didn't have science to begin with, then we wouldn't be needing to fix all of these mistakes now.
But again, it's very much dwelling on the negatives. I mean, we had an agricultural revolution before the Industrial Revolution, really, and that has allowed us to feed the world. I mean, without that, millions more people will be dying every year if we didn't have the ability to properly farm in a more intensive way than we did beforehand. Now, again, people are going to say intensive farming is a bad thing, but it's feeling like the controls of it. It's making sure that you don't forget the past. You don't forget the things like crop rotation. You don't forget things like laying land fallow. It's all those ancient traditions or all those ancient ways of farming had a purpose. And I think when science comes in and says, "Oh, forget that. This is the new way of doing things," that's when people rebel against it. And I think if you actually bring it in and as part of a solution rather than the whole thing, then it becomes much more viable and much more valued to the public at large.
Do you think we should fund science that has a direct impact on humans, or should we allow research for the sake of research?
Totally. Science should be a two-way dialogue. It shouldn't be a one-way process of scientists telling everyone how the world can be better. I think it needs to be a discussion about where things could be improved, where the money should be spent. And in that process, I think we can all learn and we can all improve the lives of others rather than just focusing on a pure research topic that no one really appreciates, no one understands, and then just saying, "Oh, it's for your own good." And that may well be true. I mean, that may have all these desirable outcomes that are difficult to explain and maybe impossible to explain at the beginning because you don't exactly know where they're going to be. So we discussed all these scientific developments where we didn't know what the outcome was going to be at the beginning. Accidental discoveries. That type of innovation is really important as well.
So, putting aside the fact that we should be funding science, or we shouldn't be if that's what you believe, why should we fund it with taxpayer money? Why can it not just be done with the private sector? Surely, if there was a need for all of this research, the need would be filled by willing people in the private sector if there wasn't public money available for it.
Again, the pharmaceutical industry is one where there is you can see the definite link between a product and its customer, the person in need of this medicine. And I think that's where private money has come in, because there's such a close link between those two. However, what it does mean is you have a disproportionate level of money gets invested into these huge amounts of money gets invested into developing drugs, and that needs to be recouped. And because it's a private investment, they need to be recouped with profit. The argument is there's lots of drugs that will be researched that won't have any output, and they won't necessarily be able to have this magical cure that they wanted, and you've got to be able to pay for that research development as well. But the end result is that the drugs that do get created end up being incredibly expensive, and we all end up paying for it through our taxes. So it's that decision to invest early and have a 10-15 year lifespan before you have an output. That's very tough for people in power and governments to put forward, because it's had such a long lifespan. It's you can start it at one point and you won't see the benefits of it for many, many years. Again, that's where you need the public support. You need someone to say, okay, we might not see the benefit right now, but it is something that we want to see in the future, and something we want to invest in and make better.
What are your thoughts on the ethical dilemmas surrounding some scientific research?
There are huge ethical dilemmas around certain areas of research, and that is the issue where we come up against that if respectable governments don't look into this, then others will. And you end up leaving a hole that others can investigate and potentially do more harm than good. If we just left all genetic engineering and cloning to someone else, because someone else will do it, it's possible to do that now, you're leaving a big black hole and an area that you can't look into. Let's go back to telecommunications. Let's look at the whole 5G arguments at the moment about security. we are pushing we are pushing Huawei and the Chinese government away from any control because we are isolating them. And the more you isolate someone, the more they build in their own systems, and the less we know about them. So the less you do about it, the less research you have about it, we've basically disenfranchised ourselves, and we're going to be relying on technology that we know less about. And that has to be a bad thing. You can't say, as soon as you give a monopoly or a partial monopoly to someone, then that is a real problem. So we have to have a wide berth of knowledge in order to make sure that we understand what we're buying into, what's happening. And I think if you franchise that out to someone else, no matter who it be, whether it's private industry or another country, then you are giving something and you don't exactly know what you're giving away. And I don't think you can the important thing is I don't think you can just let the economics decide that. I think all too often we say it comes into economics, so people wouldn't buy it if they didn't want it. Unfortunately, I mean, so for example, the great example of this is chickens. If we look at either eggs or the chicken products themselves, we say, okay, so if people didn't want battery farmed hens, if they wanted all of them to be free range and organic, then they would buy the free range and organic. That supposes that everybody can afford that, and that's the problem. You take out a group of people and you say, right, well, you've got to make the ethical decisions by saying what you can afford. And after you do that, you've entered into sort of social engineering as opposed to any ethical decisions in it. So I think that's where sometimes that consumer demand and isn't always a best indicator of what's important. And I think you do need honest discussions, and you do need the ability to say to people, these are the pros, these are the cons, and for them to make up their own mind, essentially using that information, and not just have one-sided discussions about saying this is bad for you, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this, because then people will just rebel against that, and they'll say, well, if you're telling me I can't do something, why? What is it? Why are you telling me I can't buy cheap food if I want to?
Yeah, I guess thinking back to the ethical dilemmas, the thing I think of most often is probably about gene editing. And I guess there was a controversial story a few years back about a couple of babies born in China, I believe, that had their genes edited using CRISPR technology, and that received a lot of backlash in news around the world. People didn't believe it was morally right for the scientists to have edited the babies like that. But then I guess we can think back where not too long ago test tube babies also received similar backlash, and now in vitro fertilization is such a big thing. Like, no one bats an eye if someone has a procedure like that done. So maybe it's about the public coming to accept some of these things, and when it becomes more widely known, it becomes more publicly accepted. I'm not sure that's the case for all types of research that have ethical problems with them, but I guess in this case that's how it worked out. So maybe that seems to be the common denominator between all of these things.
The final thing I want to say is, as scientists, we don't know where the outcome of our research is always going to be. So you can't say we can be the moral responsibility of this. You can't give that moral responsibility to a scientist and say, well, it's your responsibility to say whether this is good or bad. We don't know as much as the general public know. I mean, nobody knows sometimes where this is going to go. And I think that's an important point to make, that just because you are knowledgeable in something doesn't mean you can see the future, and doesn't mean you can see how your research might be used or misused.
I think a lot of things can be used for both good and bad. So, I think most people would agree the internet is a good thing. I don't think many people would claim that it's evil or it's, I don't know, not useful. But there are facets of the internet that are used for evil. So, a lot of things on the dark web, people use the internet for nefarious purposes as well. So you can't control how the internet is used once it's out there. All you can do is put it out there and hope that people are using it for good, which I would say most people are. So that's all we have time for today. I really hope that you enjoyed listening to us talk about this. Once again, we aren't experts and all of the opinions expressed are our own. There are a lot of great resources that you can read up on online that I will link below, talking about some of these points in more depth if that's something you want to read up on. And thank you for listening. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.